All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the AITEC Podcast. I'm Sam Bennett, and today, along with Roberto García, we are interviewing the philosopher Jacob Browning. Jacob is a professor at Baruch College, CUNY in New York City. His work focuses on the history of philosophy, the philosophy of mind, and the philosophy of technology. So, Jacob, thanks so much for coming on.
Thank you guys for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, basically, we're going to be discussing themes from your recent article, Intentionality All-Stars Redux. Do language models know what they are talking about? So before we kind of dive into the article, could you just tell us a little bit about yourself, like, where you grew up and maybe like how you first got into philosophy?
Sure. Yeah. So I am originally from New Mexico and grew up there, then went to college in LA and then came to grad school in New York. And I've been here in New York ever since. I got into philosophy. I was a religion major back in college, and so I was kind of on the edge there of philosophy. But I was taking great books courses, and I read Kant's Groundwork of the Metaphysics, and then Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, and Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling. And I was like, there's a discipline out here that I think I might actually be better fitted for. And so I kind of was near the end of my degree anyway, finished that, but then I transitioned, read a ton of philosophy for a few years, and then came to the new school and was really invested in Kant and Hegel, which was kind of the new school thing. Lots of time there with the Bernsteins, studying Kant and Hegel. So yeah, that was kind of what got me into this. And I was really just still a big fan of great books because I just love reading the history of these things.
Awesome. Yeah. And we'll definitely be talking a little bit of Kant in this conversation, I think. So that's cool. So your work, is investigating language models, and you're kind of asking this question of whether they know what they are talking about. So maybe we can just kind of start with that question. It seems like to know what you're talking about, it's more than just producing fluent sentences or saying things that sound right. So it's not just like talking in a convincing way. But yeah, I guess, I don't know. Can you kind of like talk a little bit about what does it mean to know what you're talking about, and how did you get into this question?
So, I mean, early on, when I was back working I was with Jan LeCun in his lab, and Jan has always been really super focused on kind of world model questions of like, how do you get the intelligence of, say, a cat was his thing. And I spent a little time up, in Boston, and the question there was, how do you get the intelligence of a 3-year-old? And these kind of questions are like embodied intelligence and intuitive physics, your ability to move about the world and predict changes and things like that. And so their questions were very much grounded in how do we have an understanding of the physical world, the social world, and so on. And so when language models came out, there was this really superficial level to them where they often said really compelling things, but when you probe them for their intuitive physics understanding, are they going to understand what happens, when you kick a table? Are they going to understand that the things on the table will fall? They were really messy on that. They've remained really messy on these questions. And so you saw this kind of gap between the competence they display with language and the underlying comprehension about kind of the way the world works, the way things happen, that you would expect to find in any kind of mammal that's sufficiently sophisticated, the capacity to predict how objects are going to react and so on. And that's just been something that neural networks have struggled with. And I kind of wanted to bring out like, look, why is it that they're so competent and they do such a good job and they're able to pass these tests on the one hand, and they also say really stupid things kind of regularly? How is it this kind of tension coming about? And so I wanted to kind of answer that by saying, look, there's a deeper level that we sometimes associate with understanding that goes beyond mere competence with saying the right thing.
Good. Maybe we can really quickly on that whole idea of like intuitive physics. So that's like the idea, like obviously, not all of us have much of a grasp, let's say, on Newtonian mechanics and all that, or whatever. I don't. But anyway, I do have the sense, though, that like objects, they're persisting over time. When I leave a room, the table continues. Solid objects are not like passing through each other. I can't get this cup to go through this chair. Things are like, when they fall, they're generally falling downward. And then I guess it's like, is it with large language models? You could probably ask it a lot of sophisticated questions about Newton and relativity theory, and they would blow most people out of the water. But could you just maybe like expand on like what are some of the things that they sometimes like goof up when it comes
So
to
yeah, I'll give my favorite example of this because it was one from a paper back in 2022 that kind of floats around, and I think I discuss it in the Intentionality All-Stars piece. Involves a couch, and they say, how do you get a couch to the roof, without using the stairs or a pulley? And it's actually kind of a hard problem. I don't know, I'm kind of like, well, what would you do for that? But there's obvious things you can't do. And the language model often suggests things that are just straight out forbidden, like inflating the couch so it floats to the roof. And you go, yeah, that's not how. No. And the other one that I always love is lower it from a truck bed. And what I like about lowering from a truck bed is there's like an obvious sense, like if you can't raise it, you have to lower it. But there's no way the whole problem of getting the truck to the roof is even more complicated. So you kind of have this illusion that they're fully on board with the physics of the world and they could easily pass a physics test. And then you kind of give them a bespoke problem that actually requires some thinking through. And they often do things that are real superficial. If I wanted to get something to float or to get something to be raised, I might inflate it. You go, okay. If I wanted to get something and I can't raise it, I might lower it. Okay. So there's this kind of intuitive logic to what they're doing at the level of language that doesn't work with the actual physics of the world.
I guess I want to add another layer of complexity here, though, because even though it does seem like the large language models, if you ask the right questions, you can kind of see their failures. But for the most part, they're so seductive, and they sort of lull us into thinking, in regular usages, into thinking that they kind of know what they're talking about. Maybe you can tell us about this whole idea that we're sort of sitting ducks for, falling for large language models.
Yeah. So I forgot the name of the study, but way back in the 1940s, they did some very basic studies about. They just put little tiny graphics on a screen. One was a circle, one was a triangle. And they moved in kind of irregular ways that, where they bumped into each other and kind of went around each other and stuff. They didn't make like physics moves. It wasn't like straight lines. It was kind of more animated moves. And when children, 4-year-olds, looked at this, they ascribed intentional descriptions. They said, oh, it believes that it's blocking its path, or it wants to get around it, or the other one's being mean and it's blocking it. They immediately ascribe, even to these geometric shapes, kind of the language we would expect of an intelligent agent. And so this has kind of come to be this assumption of the kind of baseline intentional stance that Bennett sometimes talk about, that just we encounter something that behaves in complicated ways. It's really very natural to reach for intentional descriptions and say it has beliefs, desires, emotions. It's kind of doing things to block other people or assist other people and so on. That is really hard. It's, sometimes, again, another type of intuitive. We sometimes call that intuitive psychology. It shows up very young, not quite in my 6-month-old, but, give her another year, you'll start to see them, picking up on my kind of theory of mind. They'll ascribe intentions to me. They'll try and figure out what I'm trying to do. They'll start to predict my behavior in terms of what they think I'm trying to do and what I want. So very early developing, very natural to ascribe it in non-human and even non-biological objects. And so you get a machine that talks, boy, it's absolutely overkill. Like, we're already sitting ducks for this kind of behavior. And then these are so intelligent in so many ways that we're just sitting ducks. Yes, absolutely. And, it's been kind of a tragic watching people succumb to this, because very early on we had the Blake Lemoine case where he thought they were conscious and called a lawyer and tried to file a habeas corpus petition. And now we have people with AI psychosis. It's just very hard not to ascribe a mind to these machines and to assume they know what they're talking about, assume they have agency and an identity and the whole lot of it. So just kind of a basic hardwired aspect about us and hard to avoid.
Yeah, I wanted to highlight for the listeners what sort of a perilous situation we're in, right? Because on the one hand, it's so natural, as you just explained, to ascribe to them minds. But when we have frameworks like the one you're going to present today for kind of testing that and inquiring that, there really is some glaring problems there that you make obvious, but they're not. They're intuitive once you present the framework. I guess what I'm saying. I guess I'm already lauding your paper.
Maybe we can kind of try to describe your overall position at this point, just so the listener can kind of get a sense of the big picture view here. So
sure.
It seems like, your thought is, no, large language models do not understand what they're talking about. And the reason they don't understand what they're talking about is that they lack the conditions required for something called intentionality. They lack the conditions for intentionality. And you actually, in your work, you've kind of talked about different conditions. There's multiple conditions that something would need to meet in order to count as having intentionality. So maybe we can start with intentionality. How would you define that, and then why is that so crucial for something having genuine understanding?
Sure. So kind of a big picture thing. Kant is famous for the problem of intentionality, and he asks in the first edition Paralogisms, how is it that our thoughts and experiences can be about the world? And this aboutness question, how is it that we have all these, sensory experiences and data that happen to us, and we know they're not just our own subjective experience. They're actually about something independent of us that, persists and can falsify our beliefs and the whole lot of it. And he says, in order for you to have this, there's a bunch of conditions that need to be met for intentionality, for our thoughts to actually be about the world. And some of them are what he calls some pure concepts, space-time, objects, causality. Some of them are formal conditions. He says you kind of have to have a mind underwritten by logic. Some of them are rational principles about how the world all hangs together. And the last one is a unified self. And so the paper is basically saying, look, this is a big problem. We have this question of how do we know if these models are talking about the world or are just using words? And what we want is some way of deciding, are the words about our world or are they about something else? Or about nothing? Or are they just, purely parroting things they've heard, as, the Emily Bender's stochastic parrots? And Kant's conditions provide a mechanism for saying, well, look, here's a way of deciding, do these things actually know what they're talking about? Do they have true beliefs? Do they have, are they making claims? Are they making assertions? Are they actually using language as full-blooded language? Or on the other hand, is it just play of words? The other thing, though, is the paper's supposed to help us realize what people are already doing. The conditions Kant lays out are also things that we just care about kind of independently, and Kant provides a framework for saying, like, here's why Noam Chomsky's complaining about this thing. Here's why Piantadosi and Hill are saying that, yes, these things actually do have understanding. Here's why Mayewald and Ivanova are saying, no, it's not going to do it. So I'm trying to also provide a framework for you to understand why different people are reacting different ways to this thing.
So quick follow-up on that. So you're kind of inspired by Kant here. Kant is saying, for a system to have intentionality, in other words, for it to have representations that are about the world, four conditions would need to be met. And, so you just ran through that, there's some pure concepts, there's some more like formal things about like logical consistency, inferential structure, that sort of stuff. And then there's some rational principles, there's the unified self. So one question I just wanted to really quickly ask is, would it be possible in Kant's mind or in your mind for something to like satisfy a couple of those or one of those and therefore have some intentionality, but not like full-blown intentionality? So I guess I want to just ask, do you think, is it possible for something to have like degrees of intentionality to satisfy some of them, but not others of them? Or how do you look at that kind of question?
So, yeah, there's, and the paper is kind of a reference to John Hoagland's Intentionality All-Stars. And in other papers, he sometimes talks about ersatz intentionality. And what he means by ersatz intentionality is kind of this derivative notion where there's, systems that have a kind of derivative intentionality, or they have something a lot like intentionality, but in some ways deficient. And one way of thinking about this, we often with understanding, and I endorse this as well. I think if you want to say these language models have understanding in a really loose sense of like being competent with language, I'm fine with that. I think I've endorsed that in places. These are very competent with language. The question is, are they actually understanding what they're talking about in this deeper comprehension sense, or even a deeper sense than that, which is kind of what Kant's after. But when we study, say, animals, you study in, the crows, and they do this cool trick. Like they'll drop pebbles in water to displace some of the water, and it raises some food to it. And there's an obvious competence in terms of getting the food out of the tube using the rocks. But then scientists come along, do they know what they're doing? Or is this just a, dumb behavior? And so they come up with like tricks to see if, can you use displacement in other scenarios? And some crows can, some crows can't. And in that case, you're asking about kind of the underlying reasons these things happen. And some crows can't. And that tells you can be competent without the comprehension. You can have the comprehension about this problem, but still fail on other causal issues. So I think there's kind of a lot of dimensions here that are separable in the sense that we have lots of little representations that, you can have an evolved representation to do this task, or an evolved representation to have a cognitive map. But what Kant's after is a kind of rational mindedness, where you actually have kind of a comprehensive understanding of the world. It's not just piecemeal. It's not just different competencies that you've, say, evolved or have innate dispositions towards. It's a real capacity to make sense of your world that he thinks is uniquely human. So derivative, yeah, I think lots of animals can have kind of a derivative one that's not going to have the logic aspect, not going to have all the rational aspects, are going to have some, gaps in their intuitive physics and so on. But the full sense of it that we would expect for somebody who uses language effectively as these language models, no, if you're going to use language as effectively as a human, you should probably have the whole gamut there.
All right, good. So we've made that distinction between, I guess, maybe understanding in scare quotes or whatever, and the kind of Kantian sense of understanding. But this is also, it's so abstract, right? I think we should start talking about baseball.
Okay. I love baseball.
That makes it easier, I think. So maybe I guess you do borrow this from Hageland, and so you can tell us about the baseball metaphor that he used and how you're using it or adapting it, and just kind of walk us through some of the bases.
Yeah, so the baseball metaphor was just a way of lining people up in terms of kind of, on the one hand, some degree their conservatism. The right side of the field was kind of more traditional cognitive science. In the middle was a little bit looser, but still part of the traditional form of cognitive science. And then as you went left, it got to be a good deal more pragmatist on Hoagland's conception. I've kind of moved away from that slightly, but my first base still is the traditional cognitive science. Second base is still, broadly speaking, something like Dennett's intentional stance and the Sellers and kind of that tradition. And then third base, shortstop, is an additional position about objectivity that I thought was really missing in the original Hoagland paper. And then the shortstop position actually is still somewhat the pragmatist position, and it's going to talk about self. So first base will talk about traditional cognitive science and formal competency, the stuff that Chomsky and others are worried about. Second base, kind of some of Dennett's concerns with rationality, and the fact that a rational mind needs to have some purposive behavior. Shortstop with objectivity, and third base then with the self.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So Chomsky is on first, right? So let's. It just sucks because I'm not an avid baseball watcher. So I should say right now we just bunted and we're moving toward first base. And so that's where we talk about formal competence. And so, I don't know, maybe you can tell me if this is an example of formal competence that might please everyone, right? So obviously, logician can tell you all about a disjunctive syllogism or whatever. But even like maybe hunter-gatherers, right? They chase some prey into a cave that has like a Y formation, and they're right there at the crossroads. And one of them goes left, the other one stays right at the crossroads, and they come back. No one's there. The prey isn't there. So they infer, it's going to be over here. So they get ready. And so even hunter-gatherers seem to engage in this kind of reasoning. That would be a disjunctive syllogism, I would say. So it's just an example of some, basic practices of humans that, highlight our capacity for formal competence.
Yes. I mean, there's lots of examples of this. And, a lot of our ability to reason depends on this. If you engage in hypothesis testing, which is what you were just talking about, where, you hypothesize the animal went left or right and it didn't go left, therefore it went right. There's kind of this underlying logic to it. That doesn't mean that there has to be an underlying logical engine. But you do have to go through something like the same kinds of processes, even if they use some other mechanism to get there. And for the Chomsky crowd, they always just said, well, no, there's a logical engine at the bottom of human understanding. And the reason they thought so is because we, especially with language, engage in lots of really complicated kind of operations. You see this in mathematics, but mathematics is undoubtedly learned in we really drill it in. And if you don't drill it in, humans don't pick up much in the way of mathematical sophistication. But language, we all pick up on language. And we do things in language that, logically speaking, are actually really complicated. and a simple one is the red box was on the blue cube or whatever. In this case, logically underneath, you have to have f of x, g of y, r xy as all the logical operations capturing which one is the blue box, or red box, which one is the blue cube, and which one's on top of the other. And for Chomsky said that's like a normal sentence for us. That is a normal thing we do. It's a normal part of our vision, that our vision does things like that, where it recognizes these kind of relations. And we do it really intuitively. We do it really quickly. We're able to vary it up. And so a lot of their argument just came down to, look, the only thing that we know does this kind of thing rapidly, effectively, and is capable of making inferences based on this, logical inferences based on this, is something like a computer. So let's just assume at the bottom, you have a language of thought, and it's not like just a written language, it's a programming language, but that programming language is the mechanism you use to reason through problems. And so if you're trying to figure out how humans use language, you need a logical engine at the base of it. And that's the first base position. And, as soon as ChatGPT came out, I think it was, Noam Chomsky and some of his friends wrote an New York Times article, and they said, this doesn't tell us anything about language. You need something that reliably does things like recursion, like he said, she said, or the embedded operations in mathematics. And he says, you don't see that here. This is not happening. This is a dumb system. It's just processing statistics. It doesn't know. The superficial form doesn't really reveal any underlying competence with logic. And as such, it's really going to struggle when you start probing it. And so that was the argument of the first base position.
Just a quick question here. Isn't that where the term stochastic parrot came from in one of those exchanges from one of Chomsky's buddies or something like that?
The stochastic parrots came out of an Emily Bender and Margaret Mitchell paper when they were back working at Google, I think Margaret Mitchell was working at Google. And their argument was actually just, these things, they had kind of a something closer to a Searle argument that really these things can't have communicative intentions. And so, yes, they're saying things, but they don't want to accomplish anything with that in your mind. So I don't say, if I say the cat is on the mat, it's because I want you to think about the cat being on the mat. If I say it's a little cold in here, it's because I want you to close the window. And they say they don't have any of that, so they don't mean anything. They're just using words. So they're just stochastic parrots. They use words, but they don't want to accomplish anything in their hearer. There's no performative dimension of it where they want to accomplish, they want to make assertions in the game of giving reasons or whatever. So they just thought it was all empty play. That's my memory. And then they went on to talk about how environmentally damaging these things were in 2021. So it was a little prescient as a paper. But the stochastic parrots thing has been kind of a lightning rod ever since, is I think safe to say.
So just to clarify for the listeners, when it comes to traditional cognitive science position, like you said, they're kind of thinking, hey, the mind must be basically a computer because the only mechanism we are aware of which is capable of generating formal competence is computational as computers. So I guess the mind must be what the mind is doing, because it's like that's the only thing we know that's capable of generating this kind of formal competency. Whereas, correct me if I'm wrong, but I was thinking, in your paper, you weren't necessarily like committed to that view. What you're kind of saying is like, hey, regardless of whether the mind is literally a computer or something like that, understanding requires formal competence. So if LLMs, if language models are going to really understand what they're saying, at the very least, they need formal competence. And there are various indications that these language models lack formal competence. Is that like a fair description of your view?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, So, and we can punt for it for now, but I do mention the second base position. The empiricist has always argued that we can gain formal competency by learning language. So you don't need language to learn language, which is the Chomsky argument. You need to have a language of thought in order to learn natural language. And the Sellers line, by contrast, you can learn natural language, and in the process, you gain a language of thought. So yeah, I think it's just an open question. But the first base position is really good because there is a large body of researchers who just want to study this question. And so you have Ellie Pavlik up at Brown has just done tons of work on variable binding, which is, if I say, the blue cube what did I say? The red box on the blue cube, is the system going to bind the right property to the right object? Is it going to get that the red goes to box and blue goes to cube, and which one's on top of which? And she's just been really focused on this. And I know Jake Russin at Fordham worked on this as well. Totally obsessed with this question because it's at the root of compositionality. If you are able to put together a bunch of words together in a sentence, you need to make sure you're able to put them in the right order, in the right structure. As the old line goes, there's all the difference in the world between, dog bites man and man bites dog. But early language models couldn't recognize it because the statistics, man bites dog is statistically very, very rare. And so if you gave them a story that includes a line about man bites dog, they would almost always invert it because it was so statistically unlikely. And variable binding is really about saying, don't worry about the statistics, just bind the right property. And that's kind of what computers excel at. If you tell the computer this belongs to this, your computer's going to do an excellent job of that. Language models struggled with it. And, Ellie Pavlik really worked like crazy to show this. And there's other issues too that you really see people working on. Negation's a huge one. Syntactically, or kind of at the level of grammar, or statistics, let's say, the difference between Donald Trump is alive and Donald Trump is not alive is a very minor difference. It's just one bit, in a sentence. But the difference in our world is massive. And so you want the language model, if it's going to actually recognize negation, you want it to realize these sentences are describing two entirely different worlds. And we've also had a lot of studies on negation showing, no, this is really one of their weakest points. They really just cannot figure out negation consistently. And so if you're ever trying to mess with it, negation's just really, really hard for them. So the formal competence is kind of a good place to start because it just kind of rules out certain strong claims about these systems' competency if you know right at the start that there's also these huge gaps in what we would expect from them. And, the negation one's a big one. Levenstein and Harriman have recently written some papers about this, and they just said, look, somebody said you can tell what's true for these models because if you encode true beliefs, it'll encode them as much, 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 much more statistically likely. And we went in there and tried to mess with, add some negation to them, and the system didn't recognize any difference, really. So, yeah, that's a pretty good indication they're not really having a logical engine underneath. They did not pick that up during their training.
Can I summarize what you just said as whenever there is a test, or often when there's a test of formal competence, recognizing things like variable binding and negation, the LLMs default almost always to statistics, right? So, and that's why there is no engine. That's the reason why we believe there's no logical engine beneath it.
Right. And, there was always this argument. Fodor and Pashilin in 1988 argued, hey, look, maybe a neural network could implement a digital computer. Like if you trained it right, it would implement it. And I've seen some people say, oh, yeah, well, they're implementing it. And this is an indication, no, they did not acquire formal competence through language comprehension. So you still have this problem here. We can soften that in various ways, and I'll try and help that position out some. But the formal competency view is very strongly like it didn't get what you were hoping for out of this. It's not the same thing as a logical engine. But at the start, we don't know that humans have a logical engine. We don't know that that's how we process language. So the rebuttal to this is always, well, this is the traditional cognitive science view, but not everyone's a traditional cognitive scientist. They were much stronger 40 years ago. But now that we have language models showing us the potential for connectionist approaches to the mind, people feel kind of differently about these things. So, first base is kind of its own position in these debates.
So I don't, want us to stay on first base forever, but I just have one more question about it. So just kind of stepping back for a second. How would you respond to something like this? Someone might be thinking, this formal competence stuff is super interesting. It's, it really seems to reveal a super important dimension of the human being. There are various skills we have related to like variable binding and compositionality, which are absolutely fundamental. And, if someone doesn't have them, like they're not going to be able to live a normal, like human life kind of thing. But going back to the intentionality thing, someone might be thinking, but wait a second, my dog, doesn't have formal competence, but I also kind of want to say my dog has, thoughts about me, or has thoughts about a tree, or like represents the tree to itself, or represents me to itself. So it seems like there's some kind of intentionality in my dog. I mean, this is kind of getting back to what stuff, you already talked a little bit about with like ersatz intentionality and stuff. But at any rate, do you just want to address that kind of worry of like, okay, yeah, this definitely seems like crucial to being human, formal competence. But on the other hand, is it really like necessary for just like intentionality in every situation? Or
so yes, so like there is this kind of one of the questions. So the problem of intentionality kind of split in two after Kant. One aspect was Kant's question of like, how do you get a representation of the persistent objective world? And then we kind of ask a sub question, kind of a more basic functional level question of like, how is it that this rat's cognitive map is about this maze rather than that maze? And the second problem of intentionality, is the kind of thing that you adopt teleosemantics for, and you're kind of usually able to say like, well, look, they evolved this innate disposition to, draw maps of their environment as they go through it and so on. And great question. I think it's a perfectly good question. But if you want to kind of ascribe rationality to, like my dog, well, then you kind of have to add a little juice to it, because it's not enough that my dog can do kind of normal dispositions. You need it to have some broader competency. And honestly, that's kind of the bite of second base. So should I just go into...
Yeah, absolutely.
Second base, yeah.
All right. So second base in the Hogan paper is associated with Daniel Bennett. And let me just start there. So Bennett was part of the interpretivist tradition. And the interpretist said, look, I don't really care if there's a computer in your head or whatever. I don't actually care how that part of it works. I want to know if it makes sense to treat you as a rational-minded agent. Do you have beliefs and desires? And so if I'm watching my dog, pursue a squirrel up a tree, does it make sense to say he believes the squirrel is going to go left, and that's why he's trying to cut them off, but then, circle back to the tree, and that's why he's trying to cut them off. And so this is going to be a case of my dog desires to capture the squirrel. It believes it's going to juke them. So it's making this movement that isn't directly obvious just following it, but it's because it predicts the squirrel's going to do this thing ahead. And Bennett's big thing was like, look, as long as it's behaving rationally, and the interpreter of this position was, as long as it's behaving rationally, and then beliefs and desires are going to be worth ascribing to it, even if it doesn't have the underlying engine of beliefs and desires. And so if I want to describe my dog that way, great, do it. But Bennett then also stepped back for a second and said, but look, if you're trying to use this in animal cognition research, you kind of have to be a killjoy. The romantic is just going to look at my dog and say, oh, it's a rational agent. And then you do something to kind of trick your dog, and your dog suddenly just, absolutely flails. And going back to the crow, because this is the example that comes to mind, they did studies where the crows, if you guys have ever seen this, they'll like bend a piece of wire so it creates a hook, and then they use it to get food out of a tube. And so they were like, does it actually understand hooks? And so they gave it all these other scenarios where a hook might be useful, and you could make hooks out of different things, or they even gave them a hook. And a lot of the crows just did nothing with it. Or in fact, I think none of them did. And it was kind of like, oh, they don't understand hooks. That's actually really disappointing. We thought they had rationally figured out this new tool, but apparently they had kind of gotten this trope down. And we see that a ton with animals. And this is what Hoagland was worried about with ersatz intentionality. We have all of these cases where they have this representation that is so impressive in context, and then you just change the context a little, and it no longer looks like a rational behavior. Another example, just because this one came to mind, I was writing about this the other day. Desert ants. They find their way back to their nest by remembering the exact number of steps they took and the exact direction of the steps. And to get back to their nest, they simply reverse direction and take the exact opposite path, the exact number of steps. So some mean scientist added stilts to them when they got all the way to the distance from it. And naturally, the ant overshot its nest by the exact number, the exact distance predicted by the size of the stilts based on the number of steps they took. Same issue. Totally rational behavior if you're a romantic. You're a killjoy. Totally not rational behavior. So this is at the heart of the second base. You want to describe mindedness, they need to be rational. And rationality for Dennett just means they have to be purposive. They have to be trying to do something, and they have to be leveraging true beliefs. Well, they have to be leveraging beliefs to achieve their goals in kind of a near optimal way. The chess machine doesn't have to play perfect chess, but it better be trying to win in a recognizable way for you to ascribe rationality to it. And for a lot of people, like Piantadosi and Hill, and Ellie Pavlik wrote an article where she talks about this too. They said, look, neural networks are probably not going to have, or they're just not going to have a logical engine built in. But if you teach them enough language, maybe a logical engine will develop. And as a result of this, they'll behave like they have beliefs and desires in the way traditional cognitive science talks about. And maybe they'll do variable binding and they'll do all these things, but they don't need to have the underlying thing. And so you can have a rational agent that behaves in a perfectly human way, or in a perfectly rational way, without requiring a specific type of underlying machinery. And this goes back to Sellers, who said, when you teach a child a language, you're not just teaching them the words for the world. You're building a logical world for them. You're telling them about the logical structure of the world. And so you're basically opening their eyes to the rationality of the world around them. And rationality in this case, the fact that when things happen, they happen for reasons. Take some time to know what the reasons are. But if, the ball falls off the desk, the child will at least know something caused it to fall, and they can start doing experiments or whatever kids do. So that's kind of the heart of it.
So putting aside the fact that now I've lost all respect for crows and ants, the question here then is, if we, train large language models with enough data, so much so that they're learning a language and they can actually grow, rationality. Now the question is, well, when we test them, what actually happens? So, what I guess what kind of tests have been run in this domain, and why might we think that language models don't have this rational behavior?
So, there's two kinds of ways you can test this. The first is the first base way. You can just go, all right, look, you say that if you train them well enough, then they're going to, let's say, like, they have a bunch of true beliefs and they desire this thing, then they should infer, like, I want to go to the store, so I, need to go to my car. My car needs gas, so I need to go to a gas station. They should be able to make the proper kind of inferences at the logical level. And so if there's problems in how they're logically reasoning through steps, that's going to be a problem. The other side of that same example, though, is the background knowledge thing. Are they actually forming true beliefs about the world that are going to allow them to engage in planning through? And so there's kind of two sides to it. One is, how robust is their logical reasoning capacity gained just from the statistics of language? And the other one is, how robust is their conceptual grasp of the world, their kind of conceptual scheme? And the conceptual scheme should tell them, dogs are mammals, and, what isn't hammers or artifacts, and these various categories. But they should also teach them things like the steps you'd have to go through if you needed to fix a car, or the steps you'd have to go through if you wanted to, repair a flat tire. And so you're hoping that it really ends up with what has historically been called common sense. And if you get both aspects, then the machine has it. The machine has gained a background understanding of the world, and it's able to engage kind of using the logical machinery. And this was always kind of the hope of the Sellers, the Brandoms, the McDowells and others, where they go, hey, if you learn language, you'll be able to engage in conversation. Conversation involves lots of arguing with each other. You have beliefs that are true, and you argue with somebody, and you have, your belief is falsified. So you have to make new changes to your belief, and you'll be this rational person engaging in these kind of things. The giving and what is the phrase? The space of reasons, and the giving and demanding justifications. All right, so the tests of these things. Formal competency tests. Another set of tests is just how well they understand the world, just their common sense comprehension. On that stuff, sometimes they do well if it's kind of the kind of comprehension that just requires them to explain concepts. But using concepts has proven more sticky. Planning has proven more sticky. And those are kind of the issues that come up at the short stop level. And then there's the final one, just kind of like, are your beliefs consistent? Are you able to update your beliefs in a rational way? These are areas where language models really are just, there's basically no hope for in the way they're currently designed. Because, like I said, negation is something they struggle with. They also don't really have memory in the way we consider memory, where you store information as true sentences. These are all the things I believe. However we store it, we definitely have a set of things that we're committed to. They don't have anything like that. That's not how they store information. So there's issues about how they're dealing with, their beliefs that just, it's not consistent. It's not going to be a series of true beliefs that are being held and they're going to be committed to, and that you can predict their behavior. And they're not going to be able to leverage their true beliefs because they don't hold a consistent set of beliefs in order to accomplish lots of different goals. So that's kind of where those problems show up. But again, you can kind of modify these systems to achieve better and worse ends on this. It's just, this is the stuff where second base people are really, getting pushed on. If you want to say that you can acquire these capacities, why are they still struggling with these formal competencies? Why do they have this common sense deficit? And why can't they tell the difference between true and false? Those are the kind of the questions that continually struggle or flummox second base.
When it comes to the whole like true false issue, does that connect to shortstop? So the shortstop position, is my understanding, is something like, to have intentionality, to have a mind, to understand, to genuinely understand what you're saying. A language model would require a kind of objectivity. Like it needs to grasp that its words are about an objective mind independent world, or language independent world, at least. Can you kind of tell us a little bit about this position, maybe how it relates to the second base and that sort of thing?
Sure. So there's two aspects to that. One is the mind independent world. It's going to determine which of your sentences is true and false. And that's just kind of a big problem. And it's one that these systems just are not really equipped for right now. Like, as long as things like the negation issue and kind of the way they store their beliefs in their weights, where it's not in terms of things it's committed to and things it does not believe, you're just going to continue hit problems with its true belief issues. This is the stuff Herman and Levenstein have been really working on. The other part of it, though, is the objectivity question of world models. And the world model debate is like, how is their intuitive physics? Are they going to make the right predictions? Are they going to make the right inferences about how things are going to happen? Can they plan for counterfactual situations? And that's really at the heart of the shortstop position. World models are the idea that there is a specific way the world is, rules, things in and out. And we've been studying this at the shortstop position using a lot of different approaches. Mayawal and Ivanova, especially Anna Ivanova, has been doing, she's created kind of a huge playground with all these different puzzles to test how well they understand that objects exist over time, and gravity, and the difference between fluids and other types of solids and gases and so on, and just kind of probing things. And it's a simple thing to probe, because you just ask human children, even, like, what's going to happen here? Usually visually, it's much easier with children. They often can't figure it out in a word problem, but you show them a video and they do really well with it. Language models, sometimes you do the word problem because that's what they're actually better at. The video flummoxes them. So different tests, but underlying it, great tests. Language models have really struggled with it. There's been some kind of in-principle stuff. Othello GPT was designed to figure out, look, maybe these things can encode objects and space and time and or at least space and some of these other things. And the results have really been mixed. It's not clear that they're able to disentangle things like objects and space in the way we would hope for. Instead of recognizing objects can appear anywhere in the world and space is the same everywhere, they seem to really struggle with concepts like that. They instead, in the Othello piece, in order to understand where a piece was, it would memorize all of the other pieces around it. And so instead of learning like, F4 is black, which is an Othello thing, you would do, if piece X is here and piece Y is here and piece Z is here, then this is black. And it was like, that's a really convoluted way of doing it. And as a result of that, if you tweak it at all, it's going to just absolutely fall apart. You don't want a Rube Goldberg machine for your world model. You want a really simple, like, this location is this object, and this object can also be here, can also be here, can also be here. So this has been something that we've really kind of seen as a weak point for language models. They can pick up a lot of common sense knowledge in the sense that, Americans drive on the right side of the road, but the common sense knowledge embodied in our intuitive physics has proven really hard. And a couple of quick examples from intuitive physics, just so people know kind of what we are testing for in these kind of puzzles. One example is you'll watch a video of billiard balls bouncing around, and you're watching it, and the instructor just pauses and says, where's this ball going to end up? Children are very good at this. They can figure it out. We ascribe a noisy Newtonian model to children where, they're not going to get it exactly right. They'll sometimes think the ball is going to go in the pocket and it won't. But for the most part, everybody's really good at this. Language models really struggle with these puzzles. They struggle with puzzles that you would give somebody, those stupid iPhone puzzles where you have to use levers and pulleys to accomplish different tasks, or like Incredible Machine, where you do build Rube Goldberg machines. Those are kind of things kids are pretty good at. I loved Incredible Machines as a kid. Language models still struggle with it. And then one final thing that we do a lot to test this is just have them play video games. And that's Julian Tegalius's lab at NYU does this a ton. And man, you never hear somebody as disappointed as he is with language models. I can't stand things, play a game. Like, you have all of this processing power, and every time we give them even a simple game, even a language game, they just fall apart. And so, these are all cases where you're like, they should have this competence. They should understand how to plan ahead and, predict how things are going to work in space and time. And also, we toss into this intuitive psychology. They should be able to predict what other agents are going to do. Intuitive biology, they should be able to understand that if you don't water a plant, it's going to die. These kind of things are things they really struggle with. And that's a sign that language isn't quite sufficient to bring this about, at least not without a lot of more scale than we have currently.
I just wanted to say one thing to make sure listeners kind of differentiate between the different kinds of AI. But I think a lot of people just sort of have a homogeneous like AI is just one homogeneous thing, right? So you're saying large language models can't play video games, but someone might say, oh, but I thought, the people over at OpenAI or AlphaZero, right, just playing games. So that's not a large language model, right? So that's a deep learning model, but not a large language model.
Right. And it's worth flagging. So AlphaZero was a later version of AlphaGo, and they gave the exact same model and they trained it to play chess, and it played great chess. They trained it to play Go, and it played great Go. Backgammon, great backgammon. And they trained versions of it later to play StarCraft, and it sort of played StarCraft. But the same model could only do one. You can't get the same model to play Go and chess, Go and backgammon. You couldn't even get the same model to play, I don't know, do you guys play StarCraft? I'm going to assume your audience plays StarCraft, despite that they almost certainly don't. In StarCraft, you can't play, the Alpha Star could play as the humans, but it couldn't play as the Zerg. So it can only play as one species on one map. So these are not general models. And that was always supposed to be the promise of language models. You're just like, hey, you're an artificial general intelligence. You can do generally intelligent things, play games, and they don't. And you can get a machine to play a game, but right now you can't get the same machine to play lots of games. That's just something that we've really, really struggled with. So that's kind of a sign that the generality of their intelligence isn't quite what you were hoping for. And that's part of what the shortstop position is kind of helping us with.
So I feel bad to abruptly shift to the third base, but I just kind of want to be sensitive about our time. So if we could go travel to third base, then maybe I could just try to describe briefly how I understand third base. And then Jake, you tell me, like, if kind of like I'm getting the idea. So the third base position is kind of like, well, to have intentionality, at least one thing you're going to need is a sort of stable subject of experience, maybe, but at least a sort of subject or person over time who has beliefs and representations that belong to it. Like, like if you're going to have a belief, well, you need like an agent who has the belief, and that agent needs to have like a persistent identity, and there needs to be like memory that links the past and the present. So I don't know. I guess, and so then the worry would be like maybe large language models they don't have a self, and that's like a really big problem. So anyway, yeah, that's just my attempt to like introduce the view. Like, how would you describe it?
So yeah, I think that's right. So the Kantian idea is, look, you can't have a persistent objective world where, things have persistence unless there's something persistent about your mind, that you have to have some stable subject. Otherwise, you can't really understand the persistence of the world. You can't recognize that it's persistent. But you can have like a really more basic version of this. If you have an animal like a rat, even if its experiences, even if it doesn't have kind of robust rational cognitive model, if you have kind of more of a Ryle sense of these things, you can just be like, well, as long as it has kind of a persistent capacity to learn from its experiences and it has the same body throughout its life, that's going to count as a persistent self. And so you don't necessarily need to talk about what's happening internally beyond that. What has to be happening internally is that there has to be some, the things that you've acquired in the past have to still be retained in the present. So most language models are going to have that in the sense that they've been trained and they remain the same over their course of their training. So you can kind of get a loose version of that if you want to identify it just with the language model, for example, or the rat's body. But there has to be something that's the same over time on this conception, even if it doesn't have an agent that recognizes it's the same over time. That's kind of a separate question. So the separate question then becomes like, well, do they have the capacity to recognize that they're the same agent over time? That's something, the rat, I don't know if rats can do that. Maybe they wake up every day a new rat. Good for them. Buddhist rats. So totally possible. Humans, we don't have that privilege. You are required to wake up and honor the contracts you made yesterday. You are required to wake up and, if you wake up with a ring finger or a ring on your finger, you better honor the ring. You wake up and there's a kid crying at you, you better go, that's probably my responsibility. And so part of what Kant was after was not only do you have this persistent body and these persistent kind of, habits and memories, but you've also, in the beliefs, in the judgments you've made in the past, formed beliefs about how you think the world is. You have decided the germ theory of disease is true, and therefore you vaccinate your kids, and Einstein got it right, and so you will enjoy some science fiction and other stuff you're going to find stupid, whatever. And he also thought, of course, that the commitments you make bind you in terms of the actions you make, that if you vowed to be faithful to your wife, well, you are committed to that and you should live up to that. We expect that from language users because when language users are talking to us, they're often making assertions, and we expect that if you say that this is true, that you're going to continue to believe and live like that is true. That is an expectation we have. If you promise me that you're going to do something, then I, am expecting you to do something. I'm going to rely on it. And so I expect you to abide by it. And that's kind of where language models have really struggled here. They often purport to have this kind of rational unity where they're like, oh yeah, I remember what you were talking about, or oh yeah, you wanted me to do this thing and I did it, and they're just talking. and they're irresponsible in the strong sense of not doing what they say they're doing, and in some cases being incapable of doing. If you say, hey, language model, promise me that you're going to remind me of this thing in a week, unless the system makes the right kind of note in it, which depends on kind of how you design these systems, and a lot of systems won't make the note at all, it's not going to be able to keep its promise. And even if it does, it's mostly because of some extra tinkering the programmer did, not because of anything the language model did. It's because the programmer was designed a sub-program or whatever. So that's kind of where the Kantian comes in. He says, look, you have a persistent world. You need to have a persistent person underneath it, someone who takes responsibility for their beliefs and lives up to them and can be relied on. And if you don't have that, you're really just dealing with something that's speaking a lot and has a competency with language, but it doesn't know what it's talking about. And a simple, example of this is oftentimes if you ask the wrong language model to explain an article that you're reading to you, some language models actually don't have PDF capacities, so it won't be able to read what article you're talking about, and it will say, "Oh, of course I read the article," and it'll make something up. And you're like, "I don't. That's not helpful. I don't want that." But the language model is just trying to be helpful, and they'll tell you they have capacities for PDF reading that they don't have, and they have the capacity to search the internet even if they're not connected to it, and they'll do stupid things like that. So irresponsible agents, and Kant would say, yeah, that's not a full rational mind. You can't be rational unless you're responsible.
Okay, so maybe one last question here to wrap things up. We just went through 4 criteria. So it's having the logic engine, rationality, objectivity, or something like a world model, and a sense of self. So I guess I think I know the answer to this question here, but do you think large language models will ever get there to have all 4? And I guess the deeper question, maybe the one you can spend more time on, if some kind of AI were to have all these, would that count as having a mind, as understanding?
So with language models, I'm pretty bearish. I think this technology, we keep adding scale to it, we keep adding tweaks to it, but we've really just seen limits to its gains in formal competency, in kind of rationality and kind of purposiveness, in the gains in common sense and objectivity. And we certainly don't see any indications they're achieving self, which is probably good for the paranoid people who are terrified these things are going to wake up tomorrow. But like lots of people are working on lots of things, and I'm excited about it. I've always assumed that cognitive science, in the broader sense of minds are machines in some loose sense, I thought that's probably right, and probably some kind of machine, some kind of AI will be able to have a mind. So I've always been kind of hopeful on this, and I remain so. I think language models are an incredible technology in a lot of ways. I have my beefs with them, but I think they're a wonderful proof of principle of what AI can do. And even if that is not full comprehension, we've learned a lot in the process of studying their failures. So I think it's been worthwhile to study them.